Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy. My guest today is Marcello Palazzi. He's a civic economist and entrepreneur with more than 3 decades of experience launching and leading over 30 ventures across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. His work centers on advancing human progress through entrepreneurship with a particular focus on aligning business innovation with social and environmental impact at a global scale. As co-founder of the Progressio Foundation, he supports initiatives that aim to reshape economic systems to better serve people and planet. Throughout his career, he has collaborated with institutions, governments, and mission-driven organizations around the world to foster inclusive growth and systemic change. He's an alumnus of Harvard, Stanford, London, and Oxford, and bringing a multidisciplinary and international perspective to his work. He's also a co-founder of B Lab Europe. Marcello, welcome to the show.
Ryan, thank you very much. Delighted to be here with you.
Great. So just to frame up the conversation for listeners, I wanted to have Marcello on because we're taking a step back and reflecting on the B Corp movement with honesty and care. The intention is to clarify purpose, surface any tensions, name anything that's been lost, and explore what may be needed next. These questions are being asked in the context of the B Corp movement being nearly 2 decades old, and with an eye towards shaping a clearer, more grounded vision for the future. And so, Marcello, you've been involved in the B Corp movement. Well, why don't you describe, how did you first come in contact with the B Corp movement, and what was some of your initial involvement with that movement?
Okay, Ryan, great. Thank you. On the B Corp movement, I got involved in 2013. I was invited by Pedro Tarak, who started Sistema B, so B Corps in South America, to meet with Andrew Kassoy. And we had good conversations, and Andrew said, we need to create B Corps in Europe. Why don't you take a stab? And so I got together with Lane Zevenbergen, and he and I, who already shared a history in Social Venture Network, set it up. And I need to go back a couple of steps because it's important to what you've asked, in answering what you asked, and also in our overall conversation. So I'm an entrepreneur. I started early on. I think I was working with my father, who was also an entrepreneur already at 19, 20. Then I set up a company in London to do environmental diagnostics together with my father. And I did it for 14 years, and basically laboratories and testing kits for water and soil to measure the quality of water and reduce the use of fertilizers. Very exciting, very interesting. And I come, I would say, at least in part in my family, from an entrepreneurial culture. And for me, entrepreneurs and enterprises were always the kind of superpower of humanity to kind of get things done and move progress forward. So it was very natural to see enterprises of different kinds, and we'll get to that later, but obviously social enterprises, public enterprises, as Peter Drucker said, we've become a society of organizations, which was not the case, 100 years ago or earlier, Obviously, there was church and state, governments had more power, or principalities. But in the last, since the war, everywhere in the Western world, we've become a society of organizations. And so organization gets things done. They build schools, hospitals, they provide food. And behind these organizations are entrepreneurs, whether they are social or for profit, not for profit. That's the second distinction. So for me, it was natural when Andrew Kassoy approached me to see the link between how do we improve organizations, in this particular case, of course, private sector organizations, businesses, to move forward on the journey to human progress through the standards that B Lab had created. And one step back again, in 1993, I had co-founded Social Venture Network Europe, which is a sister of Social Venture Network in the United States, started by Josh Mailman and Ben Cohen and Wayne Silby. So I knew what it meant to be engaged with businesses that had a purpose. Many of the SVN members were those kind of people. Amazing. And actually, in SVN, we created a program called Best Practices of Responsible Business. which actually became a talking point with Andrew, with Jay, with Bart inside SVN that ultimately led to B Corp being created, because the best practices were it was a menu looking at we had about 300 members in Europe, but what they were doing, like Body Shop was no packaging and no advertising, no plastic or less plastic. So all these best practices somehow, I think, informed and shaped what became the B Corp impact assessment. So when Andrew asked me, I said, yeah, of course, we need to do this. And so we started with one B Corp, and then we grew it, And now I think in Europe we have maybe 6,000 B Corps, a lot in the UK, of course, and the rest in 9 or 10 countries in Europe.
Fantastic. And, looking at the context of when the B Corp movement started and this goal of solving social and environmental problems through business, do the sort of underlying conditions that gave rise to that need for this B Corp movement still exist in the same way, or has it changed? Or how are you seeing just like the conditions for what we were trying to do maybe 2010, 2013 to now?
So in fact, I think that the conditions have grown in the following sense. One, quite clearly, given the state of our political system, which in many countries has been quite deficient and quite conservative or sometimes even regressive, in comparison to maybe 20 years ago, where many of us felt, well, there was some sort of a positive energy around creating a better future. There were more democracies around the world. There was more free entrepreneurship. 20 years ago, we were in a kind of a very excited mood of what could be possible. And that has obviously changed a lot, partly because I think politics has not kept up or have degraded. So the first thing to say is organizations, of which businesses are obviously more than half, have either taken up or potentially could take up a more political role, political with a small p, not in party politics, but political in terms of the polis, or what does a company do for society. So that definitely accelerated. Secondly, we have a real issue with media, fake news, transparency of information, which creates, if you have, like I see it in Europe, 27 countries, it's much more difficult to control news because there's always someone somewhere in a country that comes up with transparent news or news that cannot be controlled. So there is a sort of the ecology that comes from a European Union is richer and allows for the diversity which we need in a democracy to inform citizens and so on. So again, there, I think it's an extra reason for companies to become more active, at least more transparent and more communicative about, for example, give a very practical example. We are working on a project around Europe in the next 10, 20 years. And Europe, as it was in the United States, you're celebrating your 250th anniversary. It's not only created by politicians, but actually created by citizens. And many of the citizens are obviously work in companies. So how do we create a more inclusive society where the voices of citizens are heard, not only our political leaders? So again, that's a third dimension of why actually companies need to be more engaged with the issues we face. And of course, climate has remained and also accelerated. So that has not gone away. The social dimension, some countries maybe has improved a bit in the last 10, 20 years. Certainly Denmark, Sweden, the Nordic countries are very far ahead in doing this. But still, if you look at the world as a whole and supply chains and slave labor, these things have not really improved that much. So I say the same reasons why B Corp became in a way necessary 20 years ago have even accelerated now. So I see that there is a real great potential.
And to what extent do you think the B Corp movement has succeeded or fallen short in that vision of creating, a new type of company that wants to change the world for better? What's your take on the last 18 to 20 years of how have we done?
So I would give it a 5 or a 6 out of 10.
I like that specificity.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I love B Corps. Also benefit corporations. I think it's important to say that there is a variation, or there is an option. It's a legal option for companies to become benefit corporation by law. In Europe, last week I was in Rome, in Italy. We have 6,000 benefit corporations. It's growing at 25% a year. And the French passed the same law. It's called entreprise à mission. They have nearly 2,000, maybe a bit more, benefit corporation in France. It's passed in Spain. And last week or the week before, there was a meeting in Brussels to make the benefit corporation a European-wide legal form that would apply in 27 countries. So that's an important. So I think the momentum is here. I think that when I say a score of 5 to 6, is that what we haven't done, and it's to do with lots of different factors, we can discuss them later, is we haven't been able to get to the systems level enough, So B Corps, obviously B Corp, any companies work inside a system. And the big challenge that we have been facing, for not only the last 20 years, but the last 150 years was the question of externalities. We have an economic system which is this extractive and destructive. And of course, the environmental social costs are not borne by the companies. They are basically dumped onto society. So nobody pays for all the extraction that we've been doing, and we are basically drawing down on natural and social capital to the point of no return, at least in terms of the planetary boundaries. We have reached most of the planetary boundaries, and it's very critical. So B Corps and B Lab can do more to reach the system level transformation that we need. They cannot do it on their own. We need investors, we need policymakers, we need governments. And in defense of B Lab, it's difficult to move all these big players. I've been doing it, 25 years ago, I partnered with many UN agencies. I was talking about public procurement 25 years ago. Public procurement is one of the strongest instrument that could support companies with the highest standards. And still governments have been very, very slow. Only now, some with the circular economy. Last week here in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, there was a major summit on the circular economy. And finally, government, at least the Dutch government, is talking about circular procurement, or government trying to prioritize the circular economy in their procurement. So it's hard to do the system change. But definitely, if B Lab with others have been more impactful at the system level, then I would give it a 7, 8, The last, maybe to try to use this formula or this accuracy, I think for me to get to 9 or 10, we need to resolve one other issue, which is that for many companies, the B Corp impact assessment is seen more like a hygiene factor instead of a health factor. In management theory, there was always this distinction, hygiene versus health, meaning, you can brush your teeth, but if you have cancer, it doesn't really help. So things like diversity is fantastic, but it has to be connected with the health of a business. So to what extent all these dimensions, good governance, diversity, of course, working within planetary boundaries, respecting human rights, they have to be actualized in a strategic way that is good for business. And there is work to do. And some of us in the B Corp movement, perhaps some of us who have more experience of running companies, starting companies, try to do that all the time. But what is the strategic significance of being a B Corp? It's, of course, not just about having a certification. It isn't because it looks good on your reputation. It's because actually you can build a better business, and also means, at least be as profitable than a normal business, and certainly not be penalized. And I'm not saying that lightly. I think that, the search for profit is one of the big challenges of our economy. And of course, it should always be balanced by other forms of capital, social capital and human capital, etc. But ultimately, a business is a business, and it has to be successful financially. And it can be. And we have many examples in B Corp of that happening. There is on this particular point, the final observation is what B Lab needs to do more. And, some of us are doing it on the side, or we're doing it together with B Lab, is to work on business school education. Because basically, 13,000 business schools in the world, there are easily 5 or 6 million people who do a business degree every year. And they all get taught, Michael Porter and all this standard stuff that has got nothing to do with the challenges that we face today, of less competition or more cooperation. And I think people know what I'm talking about. So we also need to because education, like I learned it in China last October, there was a Chinese professor who says, education is the soul of the nation. If you think about that, I mean, even in Europe, I don't think we have a government that has actually done that, to see education as the soul of the nation. So it's how do you educate your people? It becomes actually the best strategic advantage. I think Singapore understood that. Lee Kuan Yew was very smart in understanding that actually the educational level, the quality of people is ultimately your biggest asset. And I think we made a big mistake in Europe and the US in not cultivating that. So I think B Lab needs to work with the business schools to change the business education. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm still very, very excited about what B Corps could do in the world.
There was a moment in 2019 when the Business Roundtable, at least in the US, I'm not sure how much excitement you felt or Europeans or others felt, but there was a moment when the top 100 largest companies in the US, JP Morgan, et cetera, had signed this Business Roundtable declaration. Of course, you know what I'm talking about, but for listeners, that said the purpose of a company is more than just profits. It's blah, blah, blah. It was very B Corp looking. And B Lab, took out a full page ad in the New York Times with a lot of the large B Corps like Allbirds and others saying, it's time to get to work and, check out B Corps and the benefit corporate legislation. But of course, many of us also remember that in COVID, as soon as the economics changed, all those companies immediately dropped. They were some of the first companies to pull worker benefits and things like that when the economy wasn't doing so well. And, a lot of them talked a big game around the Black Lives Matter and ESG sort of height during 2021 to 2023, 2020. But then now a lot of them have either ditched their ESG or DEI components as well. So it did feel like there was a moment when B Labs were touching maybe a systems level change potential, but then it sort of collapsed. I don't know. Do you have any different perspectives on that period of time?
Well, I would just like to add, in the UK, B Corps and B Lab have been very active around the movement called Better Business. And Better Business is working with parliamentarians and lawmakers to create, say, a B Corp-like set of indicators and guardrails for all companies in the UK. And it's an ongoing evolution. To say that actually B Lab is still working in that direction, at least in countries where it is more open, where the countries are more open to this sort of transformation. In the US, with the Business Roundtable, certainly I don't think B Lab did anything wrong. I think that it was, again, as we said in the earlier conversation, being able to move these huge companies, many of which are in those days they were in the finance sector, BlackRock and so forth, JP Morgan. And now, of course, it's the AI companies, the tech companies. I mean, these are, dinosaurs. It's really difficult to move them in a different direction. And I think B Lab and some of the other associations and networks in the US that are working for more sustainable and thriving in the sense of thriving for people, business, economy, they're too fragmented. And this is partly what we are doing in Europe now, is to trying to bring a coalition, a super coalition together, because that's the weakness of, say, the more liberal, progressive forces, that we are all fragmented and disjointed, whilst those who have, and I don't like right or left, I think it's not, but say the more kind of autocratic forces in every country, they're very well organized and we are not. So that's my take, that if we really want to have an impact at the systemic level, we have to get much better organized. And that's a bit what we're trying to do in Europe, and from Europe, hopefully, to other countries. I think with AI and the technology that we have today, it's going to become easier to be able to integrate the work of many networks and associations into one, a more punctuated, effective force for change. Because at the end of the day, we are not transforming enough because there's too many vested interests that are keeping the status quo as it is, whether it's the oil companies or whether it is the banks and the investors. That's why we are stuck. And B Corp, I think, has done this a lot. And it's only by working with others can it do more.
One of the critiques, you could say, for B Lab of why it hasn't reached scale is actually intentional, which is the legal requirement, like you said. Like in the US in particular, I've talked to folks at Google, and I know like JP Morgan, I know a lot of these companies are aware of the B Corp movement. but all of them view the legal requirement as a non-starter. Like Google's not going to change get a public shareholder vote to incorporate as a benefit corporation, even though OpenAI and Anthropic have done so. Technically, I guess those are not publicly traded yet. So one tension in the movement is that you have this desire to affect systems, but you also have intentional limitations or just things that are going to conflict with just scale as fast as possible, right? Which is the legal requirement. And so I think B Lab has made the right choice in having and holding firm on the legal requirement. I remember talking to Jay early in the 2014. I was like, hey, there's this really big company that says if we can drop the legal requirement, they'll become a B Corp. You should just drop it. And he's like, I can't do that. And so do you agree that like the legal requirement is sort of maybe one of the barriers to change, but it's a healthy barrier to have on like a systemic level?
Well, I definitely agree that we need to work at the legal level. And this is not only what B Lab is doing with the Benefit Corporation, but, when I was a student 35 years ago, there was actually an American professor, Richard Posner. Richard Posner was the authority on law and economics. And in those days, the way that you govern the economy by legislation, regulation, but also other means was the most important conversation we were having. And then we got stuck into this laissez-faire liberal idea that, the economy will sort it out by itself, and the invisible hand, and so on and so forth. And of course, I learned it in China. And the Chinese have two words they use. They call them industrial commoning. Industrial commoning basically means industry working together with governments in a system level process, where I know the last I read is the Chinese government buys up all the patents and then gives them away for free to everyone in the industry so everyone can learn. So things like this, we don't do this in Europe or in the US, So it's a way of always integrating self-interest with the interest of the commons, of the greater economy, which is basically going back to Aristotle and Greek philosophy, It's that kind of ordering of interest between self and others. So I think that, this is, of course, a very interesting conversation, but in a way, to go back to B Corps and the law, the Benefit Corporation, I think that absolutely it is the right thing to do to have legal requirements for companies to basically serve the wider economy. And that's what the system of law is, Do not kill, and all the legislation that we have created. That's obviously one of the ways in which humanity has advanced over the centuries is to create a system of law. It's by no means perfect. And of course, sometimes laws are there to be avoided or to be bypassed, but still. And economists, who in many ways have taken over at least the intellectual domain of our society, are not very competent in the legal system. So I think the legal system is essential. I would go even further, and this is partly what we are doing in Europe, is to work on the idea that even a corporate director, so anyone who sits on a corporate board, really ought to be making commitments, like doctors sign a Hippocratic oath. So why not corporate directors sign a sort of oath of commitments to the public good? Because ultimately companies need to serve the interest of citizens. So I would take it even further. I would go to the level of corporate directors. In Europe, we also have cases of NGOs and other legal, lawyers. A very good example is Client Earth in London. They are lawyers working to protect the rights of the environment, the rights of nature. And here in the Netherlands, in The Hague, lawyers have taken Shell to court, and even the directors of Shell, for not doing what, in the case of Shell, the company, the government of the Netherlands made commitments for climate reduction. They have not been implemented. So there is a case in law. And in terms of the directors, ultimately the directors have a sort of fiduciary responsibility to do what is necessary for the well-being of all. So the law is really, really important. So I definitely think, and in Europe, I must say Europe, as you know, is a less litigious society than the US.
I'll sue you for that, Marcello.
The risk of being sued is lower than in the United States. So that's also why in countries like Italy, France, and Spain, we have a thriving benefit corporation uptake by many companies.
One of the things that you have really excellent insight on potentially because of you've been in this space. Like I think you said 1993, you started Social Venture Europe. You have this issue with movements where you have the early adopters. So say B Lab starts 2007, 2008-ish. All the early adopters come in. These are the people who have just been waiting for this, like frothing at the mouth. I want this. And they join. And then you have the first couple of years where you're still attracting in the folks who are already maybe 110% authentically committed and have just been wanting this thing, this movement. And maybe it was the same for Social Venture Network and other things. And ultimately, as you scale what you're doing, you start to attract attention like, oh, B Corps are cool. Ben and Jerry's joined in 2012. That was a big deal because they were, a subsidiary of Unilever. But you start to attract more companies who are bigger and potentially were not born like B Corp from day one. They weren't Yvon Chouinard or, some of these other entrepreneurs who have started from day one. Maybe they have a little bit of it, but they want to be better. So as the movement scales, you get some tensions growing between the early adopters who were like, hey, I thought we were all friends and we were all trying to change the world together and we all had similar values. But now I don't know about these larger companies, and it starts to feel like we're trying to reach systems level scale, but it's creating tensions with the early adopter groups. And how have you seen that happen? Like, I think, is Social Venture Network still around? Like there's some of these groups that are actually broke up because it was so hard to keep that going. Like, how have other groups that you've been part of navigated that tension? And what advice would you have for the B Corp movement to maybe navigate that tension?
Go back to first principles. We live in a world of organizations. That's not going to change. Even in China, whether you have a state control, there's still organization. There's still competition going on between, of course, millions of companies in China run by millions of entrepreneurs. So we live in that kind of society where the power of human creativity is in the hands of many, not in the hands of the few. The few may try to control it, but at the end of the day, it's when you get up in the morning and it's your coffee, your toothpaste, it's your house you live in. It's all made by entrepreneurs. We would be living in caves if we didn't have entrepreneurs. So we need to acknowledge that. Secondly, I think that the challenges that we face, whether it's climate, whether it is inequality, whether it is obviously overconsumption, which is to do with the overshoot, every year the overshoot date gets closer by, it's the planetary boundaries. If we listen to scientists, we passed a lot of these points of no return, dwindling fish in the oceans. I mean, it's really, challenging, dangerous. This could be cataclysmic if we don't quickly reverse these trends. So we are really in a bind, a kind of double bind. And I think the way forward is to actually have millions of B Corps, if we could. We could find every company in the world, in a way, or to be in the space of impact investing, we say, well, every investment should be impact, We shouldn't even allow in a society investors to put money into things like arms now, We look what they were doing to Iran and Gaza and Ukraine, We should be ashamed of ourselves as human beings if we are allowing this to happen, Producing all these destructive forces, destructive means of war and violence. So how do we shift the system and the entrepreneurs towards a more regenerative and positive society? This is a very big question. And some people have given up, and they say we are now kind of doomed. We are going fast and fast towards a destruction of the human race. It's one scenario. I hope, and I'm obviously working towards a different scenario where entrepreneurs and policymakers and governments see that drastic steps are necessary to create a different kind of civilization. And I must say, in the B Corp movement, this is quite widely shared. I think many of the B Corps understand the predicament that we are in, but we are not enough. So obviously, we should be more. We could have many more B Corps. That is also one of my, not a criticism, but it is an assessment that we could still maintain the standards, the high standards, but have many more companies. I told you I spent most of January in India. I visited the Tata group of companies, one of the most ethical companies in India. It's 160 years old. Why are they not the B Corp, In Bangalore, there are all kinds of very interesting and good IT companies. They should all be B Corps, But, we haven't had the capacity to be able to go there and do it. So that's a pity. And I hope we can do that in the future.
Tata Group does have at least one subsidiary, which is Organic India, the tea company in the United States that's a B Corp. So maybe it'll do the B Corp virus to go up to the main mothership, which sometimes happens.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
One thing that I feel has changed in the movement, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this, and then maybe what we could do to bring it back more, is historically many B Corp cited community as the primary benefit of certification. It wasn't the marketing benefit or the, attracting talent. It was actually, I want to be part of this community because it felt like it was very community oriented. And it seems like that's changed. I mean, partly because of COVID and just the scale of the movement, and probably having, as much as it's understandable to have regional champions retreats, also it feels like it loses some of the cross-pollination between different companies, if it's like only Europe or only the US or only, Asia or things like that. So do you also think the community component feels like it's been lost a little bit? And, if so, how do you feel like we can get that back more in the B Corp movement?
So I think it is different in Europe. I have been the last few months, so September to December last year, at 5 or 6 events. Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, and the community of these B Corps is very active. And in fact, it was wonderful to see how, partly with the more decentralization of B Lab Europe into different countries, giving more freedom to the different countries, the communities have come alive. So I think it's it has actually increased in Europe. I think it's a different, knowing the US, these are difficult times, given the overall culture prevailing in the United States, to come out and be open and, say, vocal about some of the issues that B Corps care about. But in Europe, we don't have that. In Europe, it's actually being enforced and it's becoming very, very more active than it used to be. Yeah, so I think it is different. And whenever I speak to companies, either they ask me or I suggest B Corps, it's one of the biggest advantages I mentioned is the community. Absolutely. I mean, the community is there. I mean, the only thing where I would add some services, which we discussed earlier, is take an example of Charlie McGregor. Charlie McGregor is a British-Dutch entrepreneur. He started the Social Hub, which is now, it's a hospitality company with 21 locations in Europe. It's a €2 billion business. They're a B Corp, and they basically have hotels for students, it's a kind of mixed hospitality. Students live together with executives. It's very, very interesting. Some are very smart, like the one in Rome or in Vienna. In Rome is 600 beds, in Vienna 800 beds, and there are smaller ones as well. But Charlie was telling me the other day that he wishes that B Lab would do more to encourage B Corps to do business with each other, because that's how we would actually ultimately show that being a B Corp is very valuable for companies. So in the case of a social hub, they could buy beds, mattresses, the food they deliver, paint, all the things that are necessary in the hospitality business. They could be bought from B Corps. They could source from B Corp, but that's not really happening. So that's something that B Lab could do more of, to be a bit more business oriented and show the benefits of being a B Corp in terms of business. And so that is something that you could add to the community. The second thing you could add, which we have done some together with B Lab in partnership, and we would, of course, love to do more, is to actually work on the leadership of these companies. Because some of the events that I mentioned that I attended last year, they were open to all the employees of B Corp, which is great. Hey, it's great that all people come together, but I think it's also good to be able to have gatherings and community building at the level of leaders and board members and CEOs of companies. And that hasn't quite happened yet. Maybe it happens more in the UK, in London. London is very good. They have lots of B Corps, of course, but it also takes a certain level of experience inside B Lab. And at least B Lab in Europe, in a way, is very beautiful. They have a lot of young people, which is absolutely necessary. But I think you need to have a mix also from people with experience to be able to talk to corporate directors and boards, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say the two things to do work on is one is to encourage business to business, and two is to work at the level of leadership.
Yes, agreed. And I think that's one of the perennial wishes for a lot of B Corps is the encouraging business to business. And, I guess my only thought with that is a lot of folks at B Lab are from the nonprofit sector. And so maybe it's hard sometimes to think about how do I encourage business? So sometimes it may be incumbent on us as B Corps to really step up and create networks and do those kind of things. But I agree that that's also a issue that comes up for us in the US B Corp community.
Yeah, I think that it's a difficult balance. I mean, I remember I think actually when we met, when we saw each other last time in Vancouver at the B Lab, the Champions Retreat.
Are you going to be in Milwaukee, by the way?
No, I don't think so. I think that I've got a lot of work to do in Europe now. But at the Champions Retreat, it was a lot about diversity, and I think diversity is very important, but it is not the only thing. So that is to say that there is a bit of an NGO culture inside B Lab. And if you look at, B Corp is the only certification that I think is worth it. But we have another sort of brand in Europe. Is it? I can't remember the name now. I'm escaping the name. But anyway, there are other networks that promote good leadership and good business, and they tend to be more entrepreneurially driven and business driven. B Lab is a bit NGO-ish. So I think some work could be done there. I think the new board of B Lab International, whatever they call it, does have a few people like Tom Cummings and Elizabeth Laville with business experience.
One of the other things I've been exploring is the difference between a company that's certified as a B Corp, but really embodies everything the certification stands for, and then a company that's maybe certified or socially responsible, but there's some difference or reason that it feels not authentic. And I'm curious, what do you see as the differences? Like, why do you think one, there could be two certified B Corps next to each other, but one just feels more authentic and embodied versus the other? And I'm curious, what comes up for you? What do you think you would look for to say, oh, that company is really authentic or not?
Well, this is actually the story of Danone. When I went to see Emmanuel Faber, the CEO of Danone in 2015, we were supposed to meet for an hour, and it ended up being a 3-hour meeting, and they kept bringing in new people, and we talked. And you have to see the people. You have to talk to the leaders, and the leaders are the ones who set the culture of the company. So Emmanuel Faber obviously was a big champion of what we were doing, and Danone already since the 70s was a very responsible company. So that's one thing that I have been sharing with our friends in B Lab. Maybe hasn't really kind of being absorbed enough. I think there's a real need to not only certify the company, but also, in a way, certify the leaders. Of course, leaders can change. That's also true. On the other hand, company culture doesn't change so easily. And so you can quite quickly see, maybe there is a distinction. Well, I don't know. But in Europe, of course, given that Europe is an older continent, we have older companies. Some of the companies like Illy Coffee in Italy or others, they are 100 years old. So you can see a culture over a long period of time, and many of the cultural elements remain quite ingrained. So my plea is to also talk to the leaders, and there you will very quickly see who is authentic and who is basically doing it for the show, But I mean, obviously, there are 50 shades of gray, 50 shades of green, There is no black and white here, And many of these, I think that my sense, I think I visited 600 companies whilst I was doing B Lab Europe, visited or spoken with. And I would say that even those who may be less authentic, they enter a journey which opens them up, in terms of awareness, in terms of getting to know other B Corps, what they're doing. They get inspired by Patagonia, by Triodos Bank, by Danone. So it's an evolutionary journey. It's not a static process. So I think that's partly what we always said, shine the light on some of these companies that can actually inspire many other companies, some of which don't even have to become B Corps, but they could be inspired, inspired by B Corp. So that's also a way to have an impact and to inspire other companies. And actually, I think that there's a lot of potential in working with larger companies in sharing the experience of B Corps, not necessarily hoping that they would become B Corps themselves.
Yeah, I remember Andrew and Jay and Bart used to, I don't think B Lab uses this term anymore, but they called it the B economy. Like people who are certified B Corps are only one part of the B economy. There's people who use the B impact assessment. There's all the people who are benefit corps, all the organizations, and then, the movement builders or others who are just want to be, be like B Corps. So I do remember I liked that idea, but I don't really see that framing quite as much with the new standards, which is fine. But on the new standards, one quick question. How do you sit with the tension of differentiation within the community as opposed to just everyone being a B Corp? So I know the argument from B Lab, a lot of senior folks, has been, we need to just have one thing, which is a certified B Corp. We don't really want to have B Corp bronze or silver or platinum, or because it's just confusing for the marketplace. But then you also have companies who are certified, but there's no longer that upward momentum quite as much of like, I want to improve my score for next time, or I want to move from B Corp bronze to B Corp platinum or something. And so do you think that we need differentiation within the community as a means of motivating people, or do you think that it actually is not as helpful overall?
My answer comes from, say, the marketplace. So I'm listening to what people say, which, by the way, I don't say this lightly. I think that if there is one thing to be improved in B Lab is we should be listening more to the companies. And of course, you can listen to companies, but it's nothing to do with reducing your standards, not at all. You listen to your company because you want to be close to what they're facing with. You have to know. So what I hear in the marketplace is there was recently a series of posts on LinkedIn, started from Ernesto in Argentina, in which he was sort of a bit negative about B Corps and they haven't quite evolved and et cetera, et cetera. And what other people are saying in the same vein as Ernesto is we want to go towards regeneration. The journey is to move away from an extractive, destructive economy to an economy that is thriving and basically takes care of these negative externalities. And that is different than being just a sustainable company. I mean, I love Danone, but Danone is not a regenerative company. When you're in the business of yogurt and water, and it's very difficult to be a regenerative business. But of course, it's also a legacy issue. Danone was started, a very long time ago. I think maybe actually 100, more, because I was at the 100th anniversary in Barcelona a few years ago. So it's 105 years old or something like that, You have legacy businesses which you can't easily change. It's not so easy to move away from yogurt, So these are not really regenerative products. Although Danone, only yesterday, they acquired a UK B Corp, a €1 billion acquisition that is very much into supplementary food and rich nutrients for sports people, etc. So it's not so easy to make this transition in terms of product portfolio. And on the other hand, you may have the highest scoring B Corps that are really truly regenerative. Now, the marketplace doesn't know that. So you get people say, oh, wow, how can Danone be B Corp, And I explain, well, actually there is a scale, You can start at a certain level and then you progress towards a higher level of regeneration or sustainability. So to be able to show that there is an evolution is very important. I'm not 100% familiar with the new standards to say that it's not possible. My sense is that it could still be possible. I mean, with the new standard, you still have to recertify every 3 years. So implicitly, you have to go forward and not backwards. Otherwise, you lose your certification.
I guess technically it's every 5 years, but there is a check-in you have to do, depending on your size and industry. At 3 years, you have to do certain things. But yeah, there is more of like a push towards continual improvement. And I guess the way that I see it is that's more of the compliance to remain certified as opposed to the creativity to go above and beyond and really also get recognized for new and innovative ways of doing business that isn't just within the B Corp. Allowing B Lab to recognize those things, but isn't required to retain your certification. Kind of like, I guess that's how the points would work theoretically.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. That process of continuous evolution, continuous improvement is fundamental. And by the way, I've been invited to speak next week at Change Now in Paris on something very similar to this, which is how can companies accelerate the transformation of their product portfolio towards regeneration. And there, I was asked to talk about, are B Corps more innovative than, say, the average company? And I am looking into this, and I think you could probably say yes. I mean, maybe not 100%, but you could say that if you compare it to other groups of companies, B Corp are more innovative. I mean, I think that there are a lot of startups that are not yet B Corps. That's another area where I think that B Lab could do some work, is that to be more proactive in inviting companies in certain sectors and industries to become B Corps. Because basically, if you map out the economy we would like to have in 5 or 10 years' time, those are the kind of companies you want to have in B Corp. Not just waiting for companies to come and say, I want to certify. No, go and invite companies that should become B Corps.
If you were advising the next phase of the B Corp movement, what would you protect at all costs? And then what would you be willing to redesign or radically rethink?
Well, thinking of different elements here. One is I would definitely protect the legal requirement and even go further. Further meaning, more countries having the benefit corporations, corporation legislation. That would really be worthwhile because, first of all, it's important because it's enshrined in the law. It attracts attention, visibility, and for companies, it could be the first move towards then becoming a certified B Corp. And of course, the legal, as we were discussing earlier, the legal framework is very important. And of course, it needs to go much further, not just B Corp, but in general, the rights of nature, the planetary boundaries, they should really all be embedded into the legal system so that if a company is destroying forest or nature, they should be penalized. And this is not happening yet to the extent it should be happening, So definitely I would protect and reinforce the legal requirements. I would add a requirement in terms of the leadership of the boards of these companies. I think the boards should also make commitments, individual commitments, that they really kind of, before the invention of the limited company, this is how it should be. Directors were liable for anything the company would do. So we need to go, at least in certain areas like nature and the biosphere, we should be going in that direction. And there is a direct responsibility, accountability by directors for what the company does. I would also protect and strengthen the link between performance and impact, make it more strategic. So the one more thing I would do on the strengthening, protecting, I would more frequently decertify companies. Of course, it's to do with the whole system, how often you certify, recertify them, and so on. But I think that it's good for the system to show that from time to time, those who are transgressing the system, or the case of Brewdog in Europe, for example, these cases that are quite blatant cases of, investors have lost millions in Brewdog, for example. So companies like this should be decertified, and B Lab should make a splash. They should really, communicate this quite widely because it reinforces the whole system. Now, on the things that might be done away with, I wouldn't be thinking in those terms. I was thinking more about if you have a scale 1 to 10 in terms of priority. I would say, well, what is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the 1, 6, 7, 8, 9, make it maybe less relevant in terms of the assessment. And here, I think we should be relatively open to different interpretation, So partly it's based on geography. If you are in China or in India, there are certain things that are less relevant than if you are in the US, So a bit more flexibility in terms of the geography of where these companies are. It doesn't mean to weaken the standard. It means I would do it hand in hand with greater reliance on a commitment by leaders and the corporate board. So if a corporate board makes certain commitments, like, what we did with Danone in 2015 with Emmanuel Faber, we had a public event where Emmanuel said, within 10 years, we'll become a B Corp globally. And they did it, It took 10 years, but they did it. So that kind of commitment stuck also beyond the term of the CEO. The company went ahead and did that. So I would put more reliance on a commitment by the leaders. It could also be the commitment by the investors in these companies, and slightly less on things that could be more geographically bound. If you are in India, for example, say India, because I know India quite a bit, I compare India with Norway. In Norway, it makes sense that there is a there's actually a law in Norway about diversity that you have to have 50% women on the board. I understand. In Norway, it makes sense. I don't know if it will make sense in India or in China, Obviously, we should ask the Indian leaders and the Chinese leaders, how do they see that? So a bit more flexibility in terms of some of these issues. Yeah. I mean, and then when people say, oh, it's so much work to become a B Corp, it takes so much time and to answer all these questions. No, my answer always is, well, it's a fantastic learning opportunity. You should use it at that, and it can impact your strategy, can impact your culture. So that is to say, I wouldn't necessarily do away with anything. I would make it more useful for learning. We used to call companies learning organizations, and we're losing a bit of sight of that. But actually, the best companies are learning organizations. You have to learn from also other companies, of course. So in that sense, the B Corp Impact Assessment is a wonderful tool to help companies to learn from others.
Marcello, as we wrap in the last question or two, is there anyone else that you think I should speak with that may have opinions similar or different to you, but can speak on these like broader movement level topics? Like who else would you want to see or hear from on this podcast or these types of questions that we're sort of asking you today?
I would also want to have one or two CEOs of B Corps of companies, get them to discuss and share with you how they see this. One person whom I'm a big fan of is Chris Marquis.
Oh, yes.
Have you had Chris Marquis on the program?
I think he's been on our Next Economy Now podcast. But yeah, I should bring him on this one as well.
I saw him the other day and he's great, of course, and he's always researching and looking at new case studies and so on. I would also, so I was recently in Germany and in India to visit a B Corp called Plastic Fisher. They became a B Corp recently. They are German, but they work in India and Indonesia on plastic recycling. And they are run by young people. I mean, like under 35 or so. So I think it's really good to have the voice of someone who is young. Of course, someone who also knows about B Corps, Anyway, the third person that comes to mind is Charmaine Love.
Is she still involved with B Corps?
Don't know whether she's formally involved, but she's with Natura and she's still, from time to time, obviously working with her colleagues at B Lab. And I think she'll be very valuable in your program.
Fantastic.
And then maybe, obviously it's more complicated for you to do that, but maybe bring 3 or 4 people together into kind of dialogue.
Absolutely. Well, Marcello, anything that you need right now, and how can the listeners support the work you're doing?
Well, thank you. So what I would say is in line with what we've been sharing, maybe more specifically, is be more active. Well, for everyone who is a startup entrepreneur or setting up a new business or a new division that has a legal entity, to really begin to be B Corp from the start. It helps a lot to create that culture at the beginning of a company and use that as a kind of learning opportunity, because it absolutely, particularly if a company is young and new, it's nearly a free gift. You can learn from all these companies that are around the world, what they're doing in all these different dimensions of becoming a B Corp. So a real big encouragement to do this if you are a startup entrepreneur or a new company. The second thing, which I learned from Danone, is Danone obviously is a bigger company, is very quickly create a sort of fan club, inside the company, employees and other people, to support the journey of B Corp. Because when things get tough or where there are pressures from the outside, it really is very important to have enough of a movement inside the company to stick with it and continue on the journey. And the final thing I say, which is partly a success that I learned from a friend of mine here in the Netherlands who created a program called Leaders for Nature. He identified people under 35, the sort of the high flyers in companies, and he got them to talk to the chairman or the CEO of companies about what the company needed to do to become more regenerative, more sustainable. So encouraging everyone who is not yet on the board of a company to speak to the board members, the chairman, and so on about these issues. And it reminds me, you're asking a question, so it reminds me, my daughter, who is 34 years old, she is Chief Sustainability Officer for a global coffee company. And she recently wrote to the CEO and went to see the CEO about a particular issue that the company was facing. And it was very successful. And he really appreciated someone who is half our age, or maybe not, but, much younger than he, to talk about issues that companies are facing. So don't be shy, have the courage to go and talk to board members. And there is a way of talking so that you don't become, obviously, there's a diplomacy and always as a learning opportunity of what could a CEO or a board member learn from the particular instance that you're going through. So I say those three things. Thank you.
Well, Marcello, it's been a pleasure having you on. And I look forward to seeing you when I see you next. I'm sad I won't see you in Milwaukee, but you get around. You're a world traveler, my friend. So I'll probably see you sooner or later in person.
Wonderful. Ryan, thank you very much. Wonderful. Thanks for your time.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.